Dr. Tejo stood tall at the podium, his blue-tinted skin shimmering under the bright lights of the Grand Council chamber. The room fell silent as he adjusted the translator device at his throat. His 6 fingers tapped nervously on the surface before him as he prepared to deliver findings that would surely cause a stir. Esteemed colleagues of the Galactic Scientific Council, he began, his voice carrying across the vast circular chamber where representatives from 27 spacefaring civilizations sat in tiered seats. I have completed my analysis of human physiological capabilities as they relate to the upcoming Glacius 7 expedition. The holographic display behind him activated, showing detailed anatomical scans of human bodies alongside environmental data from the ice planet. The contrast was stark and deliberate. As you can see, Dr. Tejo continued, pointing to the display, the average human requires an internal body temperature of approximately 37 degrees Celsius to function properly. Glacius 7 maintains surface temperatures of negative 170 degrees. The differential is simply too great. In the Earth section of the chamber, Ambassador Minji rose slightly from her seat, her face showing clear concern. Dr. Tejo noticed but continued his presentation. Humans lack natural insulation. Their skin is thin. Their extremities lose heat rapidly. They cannot survive without extensive artificial support systems, which represent a significant weakness in harsh environments. Dr. Tejo changed the display to show the various alien species already approved for the mission. Each had natural adaptations, thick blubber layers, internal antifreeze compounds, or multiple redundant organs that could shut down to conserve energy. Unlike the Vordans with their natural ice crystal blood, or the Petrosians with their silicon-based metabolism that thrives in cold, humans are fundamentally unsuited for this mission. He paused for effect. In my professional opinion, including humans in the Glacius 7 expedition would endanger not only themselves but potentially the entire mission. The chamber erupted with murmurs. Ambassador Minji now stood fully, requesting permission to speak. Council Leader Kido nodded his approval. Dr. Tejo's research fails to account for human technological adaptations. Ambassador Minji argued, we have successfully explored our own Arctic regions for centuries. Humans have climbed our highest mountains where oxygen is scarce and temperatures drop well below freezing. Dr. Tejo shook his head. With respect, Ambassador, Earth's polar conditions are practically tropical compared to Glacius 7. Your species evolved on a temperate world and lacks the basic biological tools for extreme cold survival. The debate continued for hours. Representatives from other species offered their perspectives, most siding with Dr. Tejo's assessment. The Vordans, with their natural cold adaptation, were particularly vocal in their agreement. The resources of Glacius 7 are too valuable to risk on an unsuitable species, the Vordan representative hissed through translators. The rare minerals there are crucial for the new jump drive technology. By mid-afternoon, Council Leader Kido called for a temporary recess. In the grand hallway outside the chamber, small groups formed as the debate continued informally. Dr. Tejo found himself approached by Dr. Junot, the lead human xenobiologist. Your research is flawed, Dr. Junot said quietly. You've measured our physical capabilities but ignored our greatest strength. Dr. Tejo tilted his head. Which is? Adaptability, Dr. Junot replied. We've survived on Earth in environments ranging from deserts to rainforests without evolutionary specialization. We use our minds to overcome physical limitations. Dr. Tejo considered this for a moment before responding. Admirable, but Glacius 7 is beyond adaptation. It's not just cold, it's extreme cold, methane storms, unstable ice formations. You have no evolutionary context for such conditions. When the council reconvened, Ambassador Minji presented new information. Humans have been preparing specifically for Glacius 7 for over a year, she explained. Our scientists have developed new thermal regulation technology and specialized training protocols. She displayed images of human test subjects in advanced environmental suits training in artificial environments, designed to mimic Glacius 7's conditions. Dr. Tejo remained unmoved. Impressive engineering, but it doesn't change basic biology. One equipment failure, and your people would freeze within minutes. The debate continued until Council Leader Kido finally raised his hand for silence. The Council has heard sufficient arguments, he announced. We will now vote on human participation in the Glacius 7 expedition. The voting process was quick and efficient through neural interfaces. When the results appeared on the main display, Dr. Tejo felt a mix of validation and concern. The vote had gone largely as he expected. Council Leader Kido read the results aloud. The Council has voted to proceed with the Glacius 7 expedition as planned. Human participation will be limited to 3 specialists who will remain primarily aboard the research vessel. They may participate in surface activities only under strictly controlled conditions and with appropriate alien supervision. Ambassador Minji's expression remained neutral, though Dr. Tejo could see the disappointment in her eyes. This is a diplomatic compromise, Council Leader Kido continued. While we value Earth's contribution to the Galactic Alliance, we must prioritize mission safety and success. The vote is final. After the session concluded, Dr. Tejo approached Ambassador Minji in the corridor outside the chamber. Ambassador, I hope you understand my position was not personal. The science is clear. Humans are not suited for Glacius 7. Ambassador Minji smiled thinly. Science is only as good as its assumptions, Dr. Tejo. I believe your conclusions will prove incorrect. 3 humans in observer roles pose minimal risk, Dr. Tejo conceded. Perhaps we can learn from each other. Oh, we certainly will, Ambassador Minji replied. You'll learn more than you expect. Later that evening, in his private quarters, Dr. Tejo reviewed the expedition roster. The human contingent would consist of Dr. Ju Li, an environmental specialist, Engineer Hyun Park, a technology expert, and Dr. Sunwoo Kim, a geologist. All had impressive credentials, but credentials meant little against the harsh reality of Glacius 7. Dr. Tejo added a note to the mission briefing. Human participants to be monitored closely for signs of stress or physical deterioration. Evacuation protocols should be established with lower thresholds than for naturally cold-adapted species. He closed the file and gazed out his window at the stars. Somewhere out there, Glacius 7 waited with its frozen secrets and valuable resources. The expedition would depart in 14 days. As he prepared for bed, Dr. Tejo couldn't shake Ambassador Minji's confident tone. These humans were persistent, he had to admit. But persistence alone wouldn't save them from the laws of physics and biology. On Glacius 7, being a warm-blooded mammal from a temperate planet was simply a disadvantage no amount of technology could fully overcome. Fragile primates, he muttered as he turned out the lights. They simply don't know what they're getting into. The research vessel Horizon broke through the upper atmosphere of Glacius 7, its hull creaking under the strain of the planet's brutal gravity. Inside the command center, 12 different species of scientists watched the main screen with a mixture of excitement and apprehension as the swirling white and blue surface grew larger. Dr. Juwoo stood slightly apart from the others, aware of the sideways glances from her alien colleagues. As the only human in a leadership position, she had grown accustomed to being viewed as something of a curiosity, or worse, a liability. Atmospheric conditions are even more severe than our probes indicated, announced the pilot, a Vordan named Mika whose crystalline skin glittered under the ship's lights. Temperature at landing site, -175 degrees Celsius. Wind speeds approaching 200 kilometers per hour. Dr. Tejo, standing at the front of the room, turned to fix Juwoo with a pointed stare. Perhaps the humans would prefer to remain aboard during initial deployment. Juwoo kept her face neutral. My team will join the first landing party as planned. The ship descended through layers of methane clouds, violent turbulence making several scientists grab for support railings. Only the 3 humans, Juwoo, Hyun, and Sunwoo, seemed unruffled by the roughness of the descent. Landing in 3 minutes, Mika announced. All surface team members to the preparation chamber. In the preparation chamber, Ju helped Hyun check the seals on his environmental suit. Unlike the specialized biological adaptations of their alien colleagues, the humans relied entirely on their technology to survive. Dr. Taejo is watching us like a hawk, Hyun whispered. He's waiting for us to fail. Then we won't fail, Ju replied simply, tightening a connection on Hyun's suit. Remember, we're not here to prove anything. We're scientists first. The landing was rough but controlled. The horizon settled onto the ice with a thud that reverberated throughout the ship. Outside the viewports, Glacius 7 revealed itself in all its terrifying beauty, endless plains of blue-white ice under a dark purple sky, punctuated by towering formations of frozen methane that glittered like massive crystals. The airlock cycled, and the first team stepped onto the surface of Glacius 7. Dr. Taejo led the way, his specially designed suit minimal compared to the humans' bulky gear. The Vordans and Petrosians needed only basic protection, their bodies naturally resistant to extreme cold. Jumu and her team lumbered behind, their movements slower and more deliberate in their complex suits. First impressions. Dr. Taejo asked over the shared communication channel, his tone suggesting he expected the humans to request an immediate return to the ship. Remarkable crystal formations, Sunwoo replied, already taking samples. The methane appears to have unusual molecular alignment, possibly due to the magnetic field strength. If Dr. Taejo was surprised by the professional response, he didn't show it. Base camp will be established 2 kilometers east, beneath that ridge for wind protection. Let's move. The first 3 days were devoted to setting up the research base, a collection of connected domes and laboratories designed to withstand the planet's extreme conditions. The work was grueling, made more difficult by the constant howling of methane winds that sounded disturbingly like distant screams. On the 4th day, the first real test came. Storm approaching from the north, announced the meteorology specialist, a centaur with sensory organs that could detect pressure changes before any instrument. Larger than anticipated, impact in approximately 6 hours. The base went into preparation mode. Equipment was secured, and backup systems were checked. The alien scientists moved with practiced efficiency, each performing their assigned tasks without fuss. Ju noticed Dr. Taejo watching her team carefully, clearly expecting panic or confusion. Instead, the humans methodically went through their own preparations, checking their personal gear and helping secure the most sensitive research equipment. When the storm hit, it was far worse than predicted. The base shook under the assault of winds exceeding 300 kilometers per hour. Ice particles bombarded the exterior, sounding like thousands of tiny hammers against the walls. Then, disaster struck. Primary power failing, shouted the engineering lead. Thermal regulators offline in sections 3 through 7. For the non-human species, this was concerning but not immediately life-threatening. For the humans, it was potentially fatal. Sections 3 through 7 included their quarters and the main laboratory where they worked. Dr. Taejo turned to Ju. Your team should evacuate to the secure core. Without thermal regulation, those sections will drop below -150 within 20 minutes. Ju was already conferring with Hyun, who had pulled up schematics of the base's power systems on his tablet. No need for evacuation, she replied. We can reroute emergency power through the secondary conduits. Those weren't designed for full thermal load, Dr. Taejo countered. They don't need to handle full load. We just need to keep temperatures above fatal thresholds until the storm passes, Hyun explained, already removing a panel from the wall to access the control systems beneath. What followed surprised even the most skeptical alien scientists. While the storm raged outside, Hyun rewired critical systems, while Sunwoo created an improvised heat exchanger using materials from their research equipment. Ju coordinated their efforts while simultaneously helping the base's science team secure vulnerable specimens. Hand me that coupling, Hyun called to a nearby Petrosian scientist. No, the copper one. The Petrosian looked confused. That won't withstand these temperatures. "It will if we insulate it with this," Hyun replied, holding up a strip of material from his own suit's inner lining. "The thermal properties are similar to your skin, actually." Hours passed as the humans worked tirelessly. Their suits' internal temperature regulation began to fail as they diverted power elsewhere, leaving them visibly shivering but continuing their tasks without complaint. Dr. Taejo observed with growing fascination. These were not the fragile creatures he had described to the council. There was something almost impressive about their methodical approach to problems that should have overwhelmed them. 7 hours into the storm, with half the base running on improvised systems cobbled together by Hyun and Sunwoo, the worst happened. A massive ice formation collapsed onto the eastern dome, cracking it and causing an immediate pressure drop. "Breach in Sector 5. Someone shouted. "We're losing atmosphere." The automated safety systems engaged, sealing off the damaged section. Unfortunately, this also cut off access to the main communication array, their only link to the orbiting ship. "The backup array needs to be manually activated," the communications officer explained. "But it's in Sector 2, which is now at ambient temperature." Dr. Taejo turned to the group. "No one can survive those conditions long enough to reach the backup systems." "I can," Ju said simply, already checking her suit. "My suit has 15 minutes of full protection if I divert all power to thermal." "That's barely enough time to reach Sector 2, much less activate the array," Dr. Taejo argued. "Then I'd better hurry," Ju replied, her voice calm despite the danger. Before anyone could stop her, Ju entered the airlock connecting to the frozen sections. The team watched on monitors as she made her way through increasingly cold corridors, frost forming on her suit's exterior with each step. 13 minutes later, with her suit's power reserves critical, Ju reached the backup array and began the activation sequence. Her fingers, clumsy in the bulky gloves and increasingly numb from the cold seeping through, worked the controls with desperate precision. "Connection established," came the announcement from the comm system, followed by Juwoo's strained voice. "Array online. Requesting immediate evac from Section 2. When they pulled her back through the airlock, Juwoo's suit was covered in a thick layer of ice, its power completely drained. But she was alive, and the base once again had communication with the ship. That night, as the storm continued to rage outside, Dr. Taejo approached Juwoo in the mess hall where she sat drinking hot tea, still shivering occasionally despite the warm blanket wrapped around her shoulders. "That was unexpected," he said, sitting across from her. Juwoo looked up with tired eyes. "What was?" "Your solution. Your courage." Dr. Taejo seemed to struggle with the words. "It was not what I predicted based on my understanding of human physiology." A small smile crossed Juwoo's face. "There's more to survival than just biology, Dr. Taejo." Outside, the winds of Glacius 7 continued to howl, but inside, something had shifted. The humans had proven themselves not through natural adaptation, but through something perhaps more valuable: the ability to adapt through intelligence, cooperation, and sheer determination. 3 weeks had passed since the research team landed on Glacius 7. Despite the initial challenges and the brutal storm, a routine had developed among the scientists. The humans had earned a measure of respect, even if Dr. Taejo and some others still harbored doubts about their long-term viability on the ice planet. The morning began like any other. Teams prepared for their daily research excursions while support staff monitored environmental conditions. Dr. Juwoo and Sunwoo were planning to explore a nearby ice canyon, where unusual mineral deposits had been detected. "Seismic activity increasing in sectors 7 through 12, announced the Centauri monitoring officer, her tentacles twitching with concern as she studied the readings. "Recommend postponing all field excursions." Dr. Taejo frowned at the data. "These readings are unusual. This planet shouldn't have significant tectonic movement." "It's not tectonic," Hyun said, looking up from his own console. "The ice shelf itself is shifting. The methane pockets beneath are expanding due to the solar radiation fluctuations we've been tracking." Before anyone could respond, A low rumble shook the base. Small items vibrated off tables. The rumble grew into a roar. "Everyone to emergency stations," Dr. Tejo ordered, his voice steady despite the growing chaos. The tremors intensified. Through the reinforced windows, they watched in horror as massive cracks spread across the ice field between the base and their landing site where the horizon remained docked. The cracks widened, became chasms, and then catastrophe. With a sound like 1,000 thunderclaps, the entire ice shelf collapsed. A massive section simply disappeared, dropping kilometers into the darkness below and taking with it the path to their ship. The shockwave hit the base seconds later. Alarms blared as systems failed. Lights flickered and died. The main power core went offline, followed by backups. When emergency lighting finally activated, it revealed a scene of devastation. "Status report," Dr. Tejo called out, helping a fallen Vordan scientist to her feet. Reports came in from around the base. The structure had held, but barely. Power systems were critically damaged. The communication array was destroyed. Most concerning of all, the path to the horizon was now completely impassable. A 20-kilometer-wide chasm separated them from their only way off Glacius 7. In the command center, the remaining functional screens displayed the full extent of their predicament. "The ship's automated systems are still operational," reported the communications officer, a Pelisian with translucent skin. "But we have no way to reach it, and no way to send commands." Dr. Tejo's expression grew grim as he assessed their situation. "How long before an automatic distress signal reaches the nearest Alliance outpost?" 46 days, minimum," came the reply, plus additional time for a rescue mission to be organized and deployed. A heavy silence filled the room. Everyone present understood what that meant. Dr. Tejo pulled up the base's resource inventory on a flickering screen. "With current supplies and assuming strict rationing, life support can be maintained for 28 days. He began calculating furiously on his tablet. "Power reserves, food, oxygen." He looked up, his expression solemn. "I calculate a 0.014% probability of survival until rescue arrives." The alien scientists received this news with the calm fatalism of those facing mathematical certainty. Several nodded grimly. "We should initiate end-of-life protocols," suggested the Vordan medical officer. "Ensure that our research data is preserved and that we can document our findings until the end." Murmurs of agreement spread through the room. Dr. Tejo noticed that the three humans were huddled together in intense discussion rather than joining the conversation about dignified death preparations. "Dr. Ju," he called out, "your team should join us in preparing the final protocols." Ju looked up. "We're not preparing to die, Dr. Tejo. We're planning how to survive." Dr. Tejo felt a flash of irritation mixed with pity. "The calculations are clear. Our supplies cannot last." "Then we'll find more supplies," Hyun stated matter-of-factly. "Or make them," added Sunwoo. The alien scientists exchanged looks that ranged from confusion to sympathy. Denial was a common reaction to impending death, after all. "What exactly do you propose?" Dr. Tejo asked, his tone gentle despite his skepticism. Ju stepped forward. "We need to salvage what we can from the damaged sections. Hyun believes we can construct basic power generation using the photovoltaic materials from our research equipment. Sunwoo has identified local ice formations that can be used for shelter construction." "Shelter construction?" a Petrosian scientist asked. "The base is our shelter. The base requires too much power to maintain habitable temperatures throughout," Ju explained. "We need smaller, more efficient shelters that can be heated with minimal energy expenditure." Dr. Tejo frowned. "What you're suggesting is technically possible, but practically impossible. None of us have the skills to." "We do," Ju interrupted. "On Earth, indigenous peoples in our Arctic regions have survived for thousands of years using techniques specifically developed for ice environments. The humans didn't wait for consensus. They began working immediately, salvaging materials from damaged sections and organizing them in the main hall. Hyun dismantled scientific equipment, carefully preserving the power cells and conductive materials. Sunwoo tested different ice samples, examining their structural properties. Juwoo sketched designs on a tablet, occasionally consulting with her team. But where will the heat come from? Dr. Taejo finally asked, unable to contain his skepticism. Even with rationing, our fuel cells will deplete long before rescue arrives. Sunwoo smiled. We're not relying solely on the fuel cells. We've discovered that certain mineral compounds in the ice are mildly exothermic when exposed to the methane in the atmosphere. It's not much, but combined with body heat in a well-insulated space. As the second day progressed, the first ice shelter took shape. The aliens watched in amazement as the seemingly primitive structure rose from the frozen ground. Inside, Hyun installed a small power system that provided minimal but crucial heating and light. "It's working," announced a Vordan scientist who had volunteered to test the shelter. "The temperature inside is 40 degrees higher than ambient with minimal power usage." By the end of the week, a small village of ice shelters surrounded the damaged base. The team had successfully relocated their essential operations to these smaller, more efficient structures, dramatically reducing their power requirements. Dr. Taejo recalculated their survival probabilities. 38 days of life support possible now. Still short of rescue time, but we're not finished, Juwoo assured him. Sunwoo has discovered a way to extract oxygen from the ice itself using a chemical reaction. Hyun is working on expanding our power generation capabilities. As days passed, Dr. Taejo observed the humans with growing fascination. They worked tirelessly, constantly adapting and improving their survival systems. More surprisingly, they maintained a strange optimism that gradually infected the alien scientists. One by one, the other species began to participate in the survival efforts rather than preparing for death. 2 weeks after the disaster, Dr. Taejo found Juwoo outside the main shelter, staring up at the swirling purple sky of Glacius 7. "I've been reviewing my initial assessment of human capabilities," he said, standing beside her. "It seems I've failed to account for certain non-biological factors." Juwoo smiled slightly. "We call it human ingenuity, Dr. Taejo. It's kept us alive through ice ages, plagues, and all manner of disasters. Your methods are primitive by our standards," Dr. Taejo admitted, "but undeniably effective. I calculate our survival probability has increased to 27%. "Better odds than we've faced before," Juwoo replied, turning to look at the small community they had built on this hostile world. "And tomorrow, they'll be better still." In the distance, the great chasm that had separated them from the ship glittered in the alien sunlight, a reminder of the disaster that had struck. But around them, life continued. Not just existence, but actual living, aliens and humans working together to defy the deadly mathematics of survival on Glacius 7. Day 35 on Glacius 7 brought new challenges. The temperature had dropped another 15 degrees as the planet moved further from its distant sun. Ice crystals formed inside the shelters despite the humans' best efforts to maintain warmth. Food supplies dwindled to critical levels. In the main communal shelter, Dr. Taejo recorded the daily status report. His voice was weaker than usual, his body conserving energy as the alien scientists' metabolism slowed in response to the extreme conditions. Day 35. Temperature, -192 degrees Celsius. Remaining food supplies sufficient for approximately 7 days at current ration levels. Rescue mission estimated arrival, 18 days minimum. He paused the recording when Juwoo entered, carrying a small device cobbled together from salvaged parts. "Your team should rest more," Dr. Taejo advised. "Even with your thermal gear, you're expending too much energy." Juwoo set down the device. "We've modified the short-range scanners to detect organic compounds. Sunwoo believes there may be frozen bacterial colonies under the surface that could be cultivated for protein." Dr. Taejo shook his head in disbelief. "You're still looking for solutions. The equation remains unsolvable. We cannot produce enough food to survive until rescue arrives. Before Ju could respond, a commotion erupted outside. They hurried from the shelter to find Hyun supporting Mika, the Vorten pilot. Her crystalline skin had developed fractures across its surface, and her breathing came in labored gasps. What happened? Dr. Taejo demanded as they helped Mika to the medical shelter. Cold stress fracturing, the medical officer explained after a quick examination. Her molecular structure is destabilizing. The prognosis was grim. Without proper treatment, Mika's condition would worsen until her crystalline body shattered completely. The necessary medication was in the medical supplies aboard the ship, across the impassable chasm. There must be something we can do, Ju insisted. The medical officer shook his head. The only solution would be molecular stabilizers from the ship's medical bay. Without them, she has perhaps 3 days. The group fell silent. Then a voice spoke from the shelter entrance. I can get them. Everyone turned to see Dadian, the quietest of the 3 humans. He had rarely spoken in meetings, instead focusing intently on his work maintaining their life support systems. Impossible, Dr. Taejo stated flatly. The chasm is 20 kilometers wide. The nearest crossing point would require a journey of at least 60 kilometers through open terrain and temperatures that would kill any living being within hours. Dahyun stepped forward. Not if I modify one of the research sleds and use the thermal materials from my own quarters. Even if you could reach the ship, the medical officer argued, the automatic defenses won't recognize you without proper clearance codes. I can bypass them, Dahyun said simply. I helped design the security protocols. Dr. Taejo stared at the human with a mixture of admiration and concern. This is suicide, Dahyun. Even with modifications, no biological entity can survive that journey. Dahyun smiled slightly. You're thinking in terms of biological specialization again, Dr. Taejo. Humans don't work that way. Despite numerous objections, Dahyun began preparations immediately. He converted a research sled into a crude but functional transport, adding improvised insulation and a small power core salvaged from a damaged drone. His plan was audacious. Travel along the edge of the chasm until he found a narrower crossing point, use the sled's limited power to boost him across, reach the ship, retrieve the medication, and return along the same route. As Dahyun prepared to depart, Dr. Taejo approached him. The calculations indicate a 99.87% probability of failure. Those aren't odds, they're a certainty. Statistics don't apply to individuals in quite the way you think, Dahyun replied as he checked his gear one final time. Humans have been beating odds like these throughout our history. The group gathered to watch Dahyun depart. He activated the sled's power core, and with a nod to his colleagues, disappeared into the swirling ice fog that perpetually covered Glacier 7's surface. Hours passed with no communication. The modified communicator they had given Dahyun had limited range, and most expected never to hear from him again. Mika's condition worsened, the fractures spreading across her crystalline form. That evening, as the team huddled in the main shelter conserving energy, Ju found Dr. Taejo studying his notes from Earth. I've been reviewing my research, he admitted, trying to understand what I missed about your species. Ju sat beside him. You study our biology perfectly well. What you missed was our history. Explain, Dr. Taejo requested. Humans didn't evolve specialized adaptations for extreme environments like many species did, Ju began. Instead, we developed something else. Persistence hunting. We can't run as fast as our prey, but we can run longer. We keep going when other animals must rest. Dr. Taejo considered this. Endurance over specialization. Exactly. We're not the strongest, fastest, or most cold-resistant species, but we simply don't stop. When faced with problems, we keep trying solutions until something works. She gestured to their surroundings, the ice shelters, the improvised heating systems, the small garden where they had somehow managed to grow simple algae for food. This is how we've survived every crisis in our history, not by being perfectly adapted, but by adapting ourselves and our environment through sheer stubborn persistence. Dr. Tejo was silent for a long moment. An interesting theory, but Daehyun's mission remains impossible. No amount of persistence can overcome the physical limitations of. He was interrupted by a crackle from the communicator. Through the static, a weak voice emerged. Base camp. This is Daehyun. I've reached the ship. Accessing medical bay now. The shelter erupted in shocked exclamations. Dr. Tejo stared at the communicator in disbelief. By his calculations, Daehyun should have frozen to death hours ago. How? He whispered. 12 agonizing hours later, they spotted a dim light through the swirling snow. Daehyun emerged, barely recognizable under layers of frost. He collapsed as soon as he reached the shelter, the precious medication clutched in his frozen hands. While the medical team treated Mika, others worked to save Daehyun. His body temperature was dangerously low, and several fingers showed signs of severe frostbite. But he was alive. Somehow, impossibly alive. When Daehyun regained consciousness the next day, Dr. Tejo was waiting. "You should have died out there," he stated, not unkindly. Every calculation predicted it. Daehyun's voice was weak but clear. "Did your calculations account for human stubbornness?" Dr. Tejo shook his head. "How did you survive the crossing?" The chasm narrowed to about 15 meters at a point 40 kilometers north. "I used debris to build a makeshift bridge. It collapsed after I crossed, so I had to find another way back." "And the cold?" "The suits aren't designed for prolonged exposure." Daehyun smiled wearily. "I kept moving. When the suit's heating failed, I ran. When I couldn't run, I walked. When I couldn't walk, I crawled. Stopping meant dying, so I didn't stop." Dr. Tejo was silent for a long moment. "In all my years studying xenobiology, I've cataloged species with remarkable specializations. Beings who can survive in vacuum, creatures who drink acid, entities who live in the hearts of stars. But I've never encountered anything quite like human persistence." That evening, with Mika stabilized and Daehyun recovering, Dr. Tejo addressed the entire group. Alien and human scientists gathered in the main shelter, their differences temporarily forgotten in the face of shared survival. "I must correct an error in my previous assessment," Dr. Tejo announced formally. "My calculations regarding our survival probabilities were flawed because they failed to account for a critical variable, the human capacity for adaptability through persistence." He displayed new calculations on the shared screen. Revised survival probability until rescue, 76.2%, and increasing. This is directly attributable to methods introduced by our human colleagues. Juwoo exchanged glances with Hyun and Sunwoo. It wasn't often that a scientist of Dr. Tejo's standing admitted to such a fundamental error. "What we've witnessed here," Dr. Tejo continued, "is not merely survival against odds. It represents a fundamentally different approach to existence. Rather than evolving perfect adaptations for specific conditions, humans have evolved perfect adaptability for any condition." He turned to face the three humans directly. "Your persistence hunting didn't just shape your physical evolution. It shaped your approach to all challenges. You don't survive because you're suited to environments. You survive because you refuse to accept defeat." Outside, the winds of Glacius 7 howled with undiminished fury. The temperature continued to drop, and 18 days still separated them from rescue. But inside the shelter, something had changed. The alien scientists no longer prepared for death. They planned for survival, inspired by the unexpected resilience of their human colleagues. Dr. Tejo made one final entry in his personal log that night. "I came to study an ice planet, but found myself studying the remarkable adaptability of the human spirit instead. In the face of impossible odds, they simply refuse to die. And somehow, that refusal matters more than all the laws of physics and biology I'd spent my career mastering." The rescue fleet dropped out of faster-than-light travel at the edge of the Glacius 7 system. Three massive ships, led by the Alliance flagship Celestial Guardian, moved toward the ice planet with solemn purpose. Captain Minho stood on the bridge, mentally preparing himself for what they would likely find. Latest scans show minimal heat signatures at the research base coordinates, his first officer reported quietly, given the time elapsed and the planet's conditions. Captain Minho nodded grimly. Prepare the recovery teams. We'll need to document everything carefully for the families. The rescue mission had been organized as soon as the automated distress signal reached Alliance space, but logistics and distance meant 63 days had passed since the ice shelf collapse. No one aboard the rescue fleet expected survivors. "Sir," the communications officer called out suddenly, "we're receiving a transmission from the surface." Shocked silence fell across the bridge. The captain moved quickly to the communications station. "Put it through," he ordered. A voice crackled over the speakers, breaking through layers of atmospheric interference. "Alliance Rescue Fleet, this is Glacius 7 Research Base. We are transmitting coordinates for a safe landing zone. Please approach from the southern quadrant to avoid unstable ice formations. We have 18 survivors awaiting extraction." Captain Minho stared at the communications officer in disbelief. "Confirm that transmission." "Confirmed, sir. It's coming from the research base. The signal is weak but authentic." Within hours, the first shuttle descended through Glacius 7's turbulent atmosphere. As they broke through the cloud layer, the rescue team stared in amazement at what lay below. Instead of a damaged research base, they saw what looked like a small village constructed of ice and salvaged materials. Solar collectors built from research equipment dotted the landscape, and smoke rose from several carefully constructed vents. When the shuttle landed, Captain Minho was the first to disembark. He had expected to find desperate survivors on the brink of death. Instead, a group of thin but remarkably healthy-looking scientists greeted him, headed by a blue-skinned Cerulean and a human woman. "Dr. Tajo and Dr. Juwu, I presume," Captain Minho said, struggling to hide his shock. "We didn't expect to find anyone alive." Dr. Tajo bowed slightly. "Your expectations were mathematically sound, Captain. By all reasonable calculations, we should indeed be dead." Dr. Juwu smiled beside him. "Fortunately, survival isn't always reasonable." The extraction proceeded smoothly. As each survivor boarded the shuttles, they carried not just personal belongings but carefully preserved research samples and data cores. Captain Minho noticed that the alien scientists showed unusual deference to the human team members, seeking their input on even small decisions. Once aboard the Celestial Guardian, the survivors were taken to the medical bay for evaluation. Captain Minho joined Dr. Tajo in the observation lounge afterward, where the scientist was watching the ice planet recede through the viewport. "How did you do it?" Minho asked. "Our analysts calculated a near-zero chance of survival past 40 days. "So did I," Dr. Tajo admitted. "I was wrong." He turned from the window, his expression thoughtful. "Captain, have you ever revised a fundamental scientific understanding you've held your entire career?" "Can't say that I have." "It's quite illuminating." Dr. Tajo gestured to a datapad. "I've spent the past 2 months completely rewriting my theories on adaptation and survival. The Council will find my revised conclusions quite surprising." 2 weeks later, Dr. Tajo stood once again before the Galactic Scientific Council. The Grand Chamber was filled beyond capacity, with representatives from every Alliance species in attendance. The human survival against impossible odds had become the most discussed scientific event of the decade. Council Leader Kido opened the session. "We are convened today to hear Dr. Tajo's official report on the Glacius 7 incident and his revised assessment of human capabilities for extreme environment research." Dr. Tajo approached the podium, looking remarkably different from the confident scientist who had dismissed human survival capabilities months earlier. He seemed humbler, perhaps, but also energized by new understanding. "Esteemed colleagues," he began, "I come before you to formally acknowledge a fundamental error in my previous assessment of human capabilities. Murmurs spread through the chamber. Dr. Tejo was renowned for his meticulous accuracy. Public admissions of error were virtually unheard of. My initial analysis focused exclusively on biological specialization, he continued. I measured humans against species with natural adaptations to extreme cold and found them wanting. This approach was fundamentally flawed. The display behind him activated, showing images from their time on Glacius 7, the ice shelters, the improvised technology, the gardens they had somehow created in that hostile environment. What I failed to recognize was that humanity's evolutionary path favored a different kind of specialization, not adaptation to environments, but adaptability itself. Dr. Tejo displayed a series of comparative diagrams showing the biological responses of different species to environmental stress. Most species, including my own, evolved specific biological mechanisms to handle specific environmental challenges. Humans instead evolved extraordinary problem-solving abilities and psychological resilience. When faced with conditions that should be fatal, they simply refused to accept that outcome. In the Earth section, Ambassador Minji smiled slightly. Let me illustrate with a specific example, Dr. Tejo continued. When one of our team members faced life-threatening medical issues, human scientist Dayan volunteered to cross 20 kilometers of impassable terrain in temperatures that my calculations deemed certainly fatal. The chamber fell silent as Dr. Tejo described Dayan's journey in detail. By every known law of biology and physics, he should have perished. Instead, he returned with the needed medication, having survived through what I can only describe as sheer determined persistence. Dr. Tejo's voice grew passionate. Humans possess what might be their species' most remarkable adaptation, an absolute refusal to surrender to environmental limitations. Where specialized species reach their biological limits and fail, humans continue pushing boundaries through innovation and sheer determination. He displayed his revised cynobiological framework. I propose a new category in our classification system: adaptive persistent species, beings who compensate for lack of specialized biological adaptations through cognitive problem-solving and psychological resilience. For over an hour, Dr. Tejo presented his findings. He showed how the humans had created sustainable food sources from seemingly barren ice, how they had manufactured medical treatments from limited supplies, how they had maintained morale through cultural practices like storytelling and communal meals. In conclusion, Dr. Tejo said finally, I recommend not only the full inclusion of humans in all future extreme environment expeditions, but suggest they should lead critical survival and adaptation protocols. Their approach to problem-solving represents a valuable complement to our more specialized biological adaptations. The council chambers erupted in discussion. Many scientists approached the podium with questions, some skeptical, others fascinated. Throughout the debate, Dr. Tejo remained firm in his revised assessment. When the formal vote came 3 days later, it was unanimous. Human participation would be expanded in all Alliance scientific missions, particularly those involving hostile environments or unexpected challenges. After the session concluded, Dr. Tejo found Dr. Juwu waiting in the grand hallway outside the chamber. Congratulations, she said. Your presentation was compelling. Dr. Tejo made the formal gesture of scientific respect, a deep bow with palms outward. The compelling evidence was provided by you and your team, Dr. Juwu. I merely documented it. What will you study next? She asked. Dr. Tejo smiled. Actually, I've been invited to Earth to study your Arctic indigenous cultures, to better understand the knowledge systems your team drew upon for our survival. You'll enjoy Earth, Juwu said, though you might find our temperatures uncomfortably warm. I'm sure I'll adapt, Dr. Tejo replied with newfound humility. After all, I've had excellent teachers in adaptability. As they walked together through the council building, Dr. Tejo noticed dignitaries from a dozen worlds watching with interest. The humans who had been token participants just months ago were now being viewed with new respect, not for specialized biological features, but for their remarkable capacity to face the impossible and somehow find a way through. "You know," Dr. Tejo said quietly, "in all my years of xenobiology, I focused on cataloging what different species could naturally survive. I never thought to measure what they would refuse to surrender to." Jiwoo smiled. "Perhaps that's the most important adaptation of all." In the months that followed, the story of Glacius 7 spread throughout the Alliance. Educational programs were revised to include human problem-solving methodologies alongside traditional specialized adaptation approaches. Joint research teams were restructured to leverage both specialized biological adaptations and human adaptability. And on a distant ice planet, now marked on Alliance maps with a special designation for historical significance, the remains of improvised ice shelters stood as testament to a profound truth: that sometimes the most important survival trait isn't being perfectly suited to your environment, but refusing to accept that your environment determines your fate.